Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree has officially launched in all time zones and across all major platforms. Sorry, Switch. You have seen our review, or maybe you haven't, but nonetheless, the time has come to dive back in and ask the question, is Elden Ring the worst game ever? My name is Kodiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and let's unpack 5 of the most egregious 1-star reviews. Before you get out your pitchforks, just hold on a second, because we are in no way calling Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree the worst game of all time, but that doesn't mean everyone loves it. In fact, right now, at the end of June 2024, the DLC has mixed reviews on Steam. That's far different than the 9 out of 10s and the 10 out of 10s major media outlets and content creators were lavishing on the game. So what gives? We've only done this style of video a few times before, but you've all seemed to enjoy it, so we're doing it once again, and I've picked 5 1-star reviews that really lay into the game as something not perfect. I'll read their reviews, share my thoughts, and you can all fight about it in the comments. It's a good time all around, so let's get into it. The first review comes from Crowley42, who says, "The presentation is gorgeous, art direction and music are a 10 out of 10. However, the gameplay makes the game hard to recommend. Spastic bosses with jerky roll-catch movements and a plethora of physically nonsensical moves makes the bosses in this DLC hard to put up with. You can just spam weapon arts and chug your flask so they'll run out of health sooner than you do, but it won't be an enjoyable experience. As someone who beat all the FromSoft games with gimped level 1 characters for fun, the base game included, I'll be calling quits on this one. It's fine if enemies jump high, fly, or do magic, but changing trajectory mid-air, floating ominously, and having impossible pauses mid-movement to throw the player off their reflexes is atrocious design for an action game. I'm not making mistakes because my reflexes are weak, but because I can't see what's happening. Enemy movements are specifically designed to not make sense to make the fight more quote-unquote difficult. Apparently, rolling when the enemy swings his sword is not good enough. Now you have to memorize how much delay there is between each specific sword swing, combos, slashes, mid-movement. Once again, this difficulty is made redundant by the absurdly powerful weapon arts the player is given, so we end up with a game that's not hard to beat, but where engaging with the boss mechanics is a torture. How dreadful. Also, performance is total ass. I have above recommended specs, and there is a tremendous amount of frame drops, especially during boss fights. I'm fine with games needing stronger computers, but why lie about recommended specs on the store page? I expect consistent 30 frames per second or higher. While a little rough around the edges, I do think Crowley has a point to an extent. He's right that the game itself is not hard given how many ways there are to cheese it, but if you remove those elements and rely entirely on skill, what you're asked to react to has gotten more absurd over the years. What used to be dodge rolling through 2 or 3 attacks that were smooth and predictable has turned into avoiding 4 or 5 attacks with insane visual effects that also have different delayed timings between each move. It's absolutely more challenging on a per boss basis, and that's not even factoring in some of the scaling issues the game has. You're dropped into essentially an end game zone, and the Erdtree fragment system is trying to make that progression smooth, but it's not a perfect science, and because of the open nature of the game, you could see a boss way earlier than you technically should. Now that has been addressed slightly with the recent tuning to the Erdtree system, but is still a major factor. That plus some of the augmentation to boss mechanics the team has made in the DLC, and there is some truth to what Crowley is saying. As far as the performance side of things, I just can't reflect on that with any seriousness, because everyone has a different situation. I experienced some frame drops during my playthrough on PC, but that could be for a variety of reasons. It's just hard to make blanket statements about performance when each scenario is a bit different. Our next review comes from Toasty Crumpet, who says, "Pros, looks nice, cool bosses, good dungeons. Cons, awful performance, severe stuttering on a 13,600K and a 4070 Super. World is empty and a little aimless, overinflated boss HP and enemy damage." This is the first review that gets at one of the common threads I've seen around the internet, that the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC enemies hit too hard. I for one went into the DLC at around level 300, which I know is absurd, but that's what happens when you do the Gold Wave farm a couple nights in a row. Even with that clear advantage, I was getting trucked by the Black Jail Knight in the Western Nameless Mausoleum. I think all roads lead back to the Erdtree fragment and blessing system. The team had to do something to even the playing field, or some players would just roll over the DLC, and others wouldn't even get off the starting blocks. But because they had to do that, they also missed the mark on how the DLC content scales. Personally, I think Black Jail Knight is similar to the Tree Sentinel in the base game. put there to lure players to an early demise and remind us that not everything should be killed in one attempt. It's a hard truth of FromSoft games, good, bad, or otherwise. I will say I don't agree about overinflated boss HP. I found that most of the boss fights felt the appropriate length. Again, I was slightly higher level than most players starting the DLC, but even with that in mind, I can grade on a curve and think that overall things felt in the right place. You shouldn't be killing a boss in 10 swings, and if you wanted that, you could go for a cheese build, but for the most part, the idea is to actually learn the fight and conquer it by refining your skills. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that we have another performance issue being pointed out here. My guess is most of these issues will be monitored and patched within 2 or 3 weeks, but of course there is no guarantee of that. Next up, we have God's Eepiest Warrior, who says, "The good, jaw-droppingly beautiful world, blows anything in base game out of the water. Legacy dungeons are far better than anything in the base game. Feels very Souls design, and that's very good. Largely, non-boss enemy design is refreshing. New weapon types are super refreshing too. New opportunities to get good. The bad, recycled bosses. Get ready for 5 more copy-pasted giant dragons in the first couple hours. And major bosses have straight-up recycles from base game. Terrible camera. Camera boss was such a problem in the base game, I'm shocked that it's still a problem in DLC. It's a DLC full of tree spirits, Moog Phase 2, where your camera is having a seizure and clipping into another dimension. Terrible collision hitboxes. It's a dice roll if you're about to get ragdolled across the arena when 1 pixel of a boss's ass cheek brushes against you. Amplified worse by the aforementioned terrible camera issues. Can take or leave the boss design, difficulty spike, whatever, that's all personal taste and you should expect it in a FromSoft DLC anyways. But the consistent performance camera issues and hordes of recycled bosses, I don't know how anyone can find acceptable. There is some good humor in this review, but there's also some real talk, and I appreciate that about someone speaking their mind. I first want to agree that the new weapon types are really well done. Hand-to-hand combat feels fun to use and refreshing, and some of the other weapon types they've added, like the great katanas, are already finding some love within the community. Now on to the bad. Not only are the bosses sometimes recycled in the DLC, but enemies are too, and while I do understand that to a degree, it does wear on you after a while. The first time I saw another ulcerated tree spirit, my stomach just sank, and I genuinely couldn't believe I was going to have to deal with that enemy all over again. Luckily, there aren't too many of those in the game, but still, it's awful. I called this out in our review, but it is still a small swing and a miss. On the reviewer's second point, I don't know what they expected. There was no way the camera was going to change from the base game to the DLC, and I think it's naive to think it would. Maybe it's just my pessimism after covering games for the past 4 years, but that's not just something that changes with expanded content. Finally, to their last point about collision hitboxes, yep, this feels like part of the FromSoft Souls experience at this point, and you could say that's not a good thing, and I'd agree, but it is a foundational part of what we experience. At some point, you're going to throw up your hands in disgust and say, "Really? No way that hit me." And if you haven't had that experience, you're a liar. Again, I don't think anything's changing on this front. The next review comes from Philippicus, and I'm truncating it a bit here because he does go into a ton of context and details on the front and back, but the meat is there, and here's what he has to say. In the current state of the DLC, I can't really recommend it. While the world design and colors are really beautiful, and a lot of enemy designs too, there's a big problem with balancing. Right now, even with 60 vigor, you get bi-shotted by nearly every enemy that's not pure fodder, like the classical wandering nobles in the base game. And the Erdtree fragments that should make your damage and defenses increases, exclusively while in the DLC, don't help that much and are mostly locked behind bosses. This means that if you're stuck on a boss, you can go on and complete side content like in the base game to find upgrade materials, new weapons, and level up. You just have to get good. That normally wouldn't bother me much, but in this case there's a big problem. It's the enemies, but more specifically, the boss's design. It seems to follow the philosophy that especially applied in the later parts of the game to an even greater and worse extent. Every enemy does a lot of damage, has a ton of health, and has endless combos that leave nearly no openings to then start all over with their combos. Now I picked this one because while a bit rambly, he hits on the main points of the angst that I'm seeing online at this point. At launch, Erdtree blessing tuning was off, and they've already made their first adjustment here because there really was no way to adjust if you were struggling with a boss or an enemy. I do also want to call out one thing that he said in his review was that most of the Erdtree fragments were hidden behind bosses. I think someone did the legwork and found out that you could get 17 Erdtree fragments without ever having to fight a boss, and that's a big number that could take you, I believe it was, to level 14. If there's anything I want you guys to discuss in the comments for this video, it's this, because it's a central theme of the discourse, so leave your thoughts below. The final review comes from Lucidus, who says, "Final verdict, wait to buy. The DLC is obviously vastly overtuned. Enemies do way too much damage, and bosses have absolutely massive health pools. The world is designed badly, and it's difficult to progress because there is no clear direction to go, and most of the side areas are hidden in caves and weird winding paths. Some bosses are nearly immune to specific types of damage, and combined with the huge health pools, some builds are simply not viable, and you will have to respec to a different build." Everyone is entitled to their opinion. I believe that to my core, and while Lou echoes some of the things we've already talked about, I have to talk about the world design and progression issues that he pointed out. By my standards, the Shadow Realm is as good as the base game, if not better, in a lot of regards. It's when you start going down those side paths and exploring every nook and cranny that you see the excellence in it all. No other game has ever really made me stop and think about how to get from point A to point B, but Elden Ring has done that from day one, and Shadow of the Erdtree proves that verticality is everything. Part of the experience is in the discovery, and I'd argue the raw exploration is a fundamental pillar of this gameplay's experience. Sure, there are moments where the overworld is a bit barren or boring, and they probably could have condensed that experience a little bit, but that sense of scale is also there to impress and overwhelm you, and I think they nailed that aspect of the DLC. Lou, I hear what you're saying, but big disagree. So there you have it, 5 reviews from some of the harshest critics of Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. I'm sure all of you have thoughts on what you heard from some of our fellow keyboard warriors, so feel free to jump into the comments and leave us your thoughts on the substance, not the person actually writing the review. Of course, if you want more Elden Ring in your feeds, you know what to do, hit that thumbs up and consider subscribing. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.